We said majority of Indians are racist. Yes. They were all screaming. But they are now coming back one by one, sobering up and confirming exactly what the EFF is saying. That indeed, majority of Indians are racist. We did not say all Indians. So if you are Indian and you are racist, you know we're talking to you. That's why you get angry.
Never want to face it when it's time for punishment. I know you don't want to hear my opinion.
I'm G.A. Solo. Hello. Throughout history, there have been groups of humans who have formed systems of oppression against other humans. These systems of oppression can, among other things, be for the oppressor's benefits or gain, such as land or slave labor, or out of hatred to eliminate those the oppressors do not like, or to keep the oppressed under control. Of course, with enough time, and usually from the start, the oppressed make some efforts to end their oppression, usually by fighting back. One tactic to suppress this revolt is to spawn division among the oppressed to weaken them and divert attention from their true enemy to each other, thus destroying themselves. This has historically been done by showing preferential treatment such as higher education, weapons and trade goods to some members of the oppressed group and absolutely nothing but contempt for the other members of the oppressed group. Members of the preferred oppressed group may then start feeling good about themselves and begin feeling superior to the others, while the members of the rejected oppressed group will start feeling resentment for the preferred group due to their ill treatment, and this will lead to infighting, despite the fact that they are still human, and more importantly, they are still part of the same group that is being oppressed by the original oppressor. This tactic has been employed against North and South American indigenous groups by Spaniards and British settlers. It was used in Rwanda against Hutu and Tutsi people. This was done in the Democratic Republic of Congo against the people of Kasai and people from Katanga province. It has been and is still used in ways between darker and lighter skinned or mixed black people in the United States and against lighter and darker skinned Indians in India, especially under British rule. In our mostly post-colonial times, post-colonial with the exception of Palestine of course, many people are seeking to live peaceably with everyone around them, regardless of past injustices, and are trying to move past and unlearn the wrong ideas that thrived in previous eras. But there are setbacks, because there are still those who actively believe themselves superior to others due to their looks, their tribe, their wealth, their ethnicity, their complexion, or as you will see in a moment, the shape of their skull. Simultaneously, this is partially a result of the ongoing preferential treatment that some people receive over others in workplaces, schools, the media, and especially the media, in public spaces, and in politics. Now, it's difficult to stop people from being racist, but it is possible to convince people to not be pick-me's, and to not embrace and perpetuate this system of discrimination and inequality. In our time, we are aware of the quote-unquote secret to breaking out of these systems of injustices, and that is to see each other as human first and foremost, and the enemy will always be those who try to dominate or oppress others. Not this or that so-called race of people, not this or that ethnicity. The enemy is not white people or Jewish people or black people or Indian people or people of this or that complexion. The true enemy is any individual or group or government from any category imaginable that tries to oppress others or dominate over others, especially due to some beliefs of superiority. So if the shoe fits in that regard, then wear it. You may have at one time or another come across people such as these, those who actively work against their own interests without realizing it, those who laugh along with those who are actively mocking them to their face because they can't tell the difference between when people are laughing with them or at them.
And now you have this wonderful faggot. That's what happens. We okay? We good? Yeah?
Darling, you can call me what you like.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Those who defend or praise the very people who hate them to try to appeal to them. Those who do everything they possibly can to divorce their identity from stereotypes about their identity through overcompensation that can range from something as small as laughing along with insults or derogatory jokes directed against their demographic to show that they're somehow different from the others or not so sensitive, or something as big as actively partaking in the very persecution of their own demographic. Those who fixate on the positive progress against bigotry and minimalize current bigotry by comparing its different forms across different time periods, and thus undermining the struggle of those who fight bigotry in its current practices by making it appear not that bad. It used to be worse. Those who have not experienced the suffering of others or to the same extent, but counter the complaints or protests of those who have simply because they are part of the same demographic, and, as they would put it, have never been treated like this or never experienced that. Examples include women who personally wish to be stay-at-home moms with no voting rights, fighting against the rights of all women to have voting rights, or black people living in affluent, ethnically diverse, far less policed areas, downplaying the occurrence and commonality of police brutality and discrimination on other black people because I've never been beaten unconscious by cops for jaywalking.
As a black kid that grew up with a lot of economic privilege, I grew up in a big house. I grew up in a nice neighborhood. The way you hear people talk, you'll see op-eds saying, black people have to fear for their lives every day. If you're jogging while black, you have to look over your shoulder. I mean, this stuff I think it's deeply unconnected from reality. It's not to say I've experienced no racist incidents in my life. Right. I have. They have been very few and far between. They've been extremely frustrating when they do happen, but very, very few and far between.
Those who themselves become bigoted when there's a group other than their own being persecuted in an attempt to divert some hate away from themselves and onto someone else for a change. Those who talk of the West with a capital W as though they are a part of it, without realizing that most people who refer to the West are actually referring to a collective identity comprising of ethnicities that qualify as white. Therefore, even if your family have been citizens or nationals of a country that's part of the so-called West for many generations, to many people you're still just a guest because you're not white. And yet they all go on with their "we in the West" until it becomes gradually clearer to everyone that they are not necessarily referring to everyone in societies in the West. The term "pick me" was, to my understanding, originally intended as a female equivalent of an Uncle Tom, as in a term against girls and women who try to appeal to men by demonstrating, in various ways, that they are not like other girls, usually by either imitating certain characteristics often associated with men, or by being the opposite of what is usually associated with females in their culture, or sometimes just by acting weird. However, it doesn't take much to realize that this phenomenon can and does apply to people across demographics and groupings. The concept remains the same, and I define it as a person who wishes to be found appealing or more acceptable or superior to the eyes of a particular group, individual, or society in general, by attempting to differentiate themselves from other people of the grouping of whatever sort that they are a part of. This grouping can be gender, race, sexual orientation, nationality, age group, or whatever. People who qualify as pick-me's generally do so because they either feel that other people in their grouping are lesser in some way, or to demonstrate that they are better than the other people in their grouping. And as you may know or can imagine, it sometimes happens that when people see something that they hate about themselves in other people, they tend to extend that hatred onto the individual that shares in whatever the trait they hate be. It also happens that some people treat other people badly to simply avoid being treated badly by even more powerful people. Those are some aspects of it that sometimes apply, but very often it's simply that the person feels for different reasons a need to be seen as apart from the group they are part of, sometimes to avoid a stereotype, or to dissociate themselves from what other people in their grouping are doing. Therefore, most of the time, especially online, it's due to shame, and often they react to this by putting down other people in their grouping. Now, the greatest problem with actual pick-me's or Uncle Toms or Capos or Benedict Arnolds or whatever is that they aid in keeping and strengthening the status quo at the expense of those who suffer under it. If someone is, let's say, fighting for voting rights or marriage rights, or an end to discriminatory police brutality, or an end to the occupation under which they live, there will be those who are selfish enough to not care about the betterment of the lives of those fighting for it, but rather for their own betterment and their own betterment alone. At times by straight up aiding the oppressor for some benefit, by openly taking their side, or sabotaging the efforts of the group from within. Every group fighting for their liberation or against their oppression has had its opportunists, defectors, and traitors. The Americans had British informants during the War of Independence. The Nazis had hundreds of so-called full Jews serving in Hitler's military with Hitler's full knowledge of it. There were informants and saboteurs who aided the apartheid South African police forces during the struggle. There are currently plenty of Congolese traitors and UN peacekeepers who are informing the Rwandan-backed M23 groups of the army's plans well before they take place, making it impossible to stop or prevent massacres of innocent civilians. There were black slave owners in the United States since 1621. There were police and government informants in the Black Panther Party who aided in their downfall. There were many Chinese puppet troops that fought for the Japanese during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II. It would be a surprise to find a single struggle or movement that did not have some such people, because people are people. You find the good and you find the selfish, opportunistic pygmies. The thing is that these pygmies sometimes profess to act in the interest of their group or the truth or people in general, but very often the reality is that it simply seems that their personal experience with their own group is or was worse than the experience they had with their group's oppressors, and this tends to pay them quite well, which is why it's no surprise that most pygmies seem to do it simply out of personal gain. If perhaps they simply had nothing to do with the struggle, it would be one thing, but to actively work against and undermine the efforts of those who struggle for the betterment or improvements or freedom or relief for their lives and or the lives of others, especially while they themselves live a fine life away from the realities of those in the struggle, is what makes these pygmies quite reprehensible.
I would prefer in the future to be set not with that man. Like should be seated with like. We are not alike.
Not all of us are so concerned with the separateness of races, Professor.
It is out of respect for all kinds that I prefer to keep them separate. To mix your red wine and the white would be to ruin them both.
I like a good rosé.
However, as we discuss what pygmies are, it is equally important to understand what they are not. Labeling someone a pygmy is sometimes done to simply disregard a person and their argument due to their identity. For example, if an Asian person criticizes other Asians for something, it does not automatically make him or her a pygmy. To assume so from the start would actually be an ad hominem that says nothing about their argument or criticism or whatever they're saying. Their criticism could very well be correct and helpful, and therefore in such cases, disregarding it due to whatever perceived intentions the person may hold would be a misplaced reaction. Likewise, some people will call other people in their grouping a pygmy as an attempt to undermine and denigrate their cause of trying to help or advocate on behalf of other people. This is truly nothing more than an insult to bring a person's intentions into question in order to bring down the person's cause. For example, among white people, it sometimes happens that when a white person is either friends with or trying to help or simply does not have a problem with, for example, black people in particular, he or she may be called a nigger lover, to insinuate that the person is simply trying to find favor with black people and differentiate themselves from other whites, when in fact the person is simply going about their lives not being racist against blacks. This is in fact a statement about the person calling the other person a pygmy rather than on the individual themselves. This example was of course an American one, but this sort of ostracizing for this same reason happens all over the world, and it only happens among people who consider their race to be superior to others or simply have a hatred of other demographics. It is, however, important to note that there are those, especially among liberals, neoliberals, and libertarians in the American sense, who will show support for groups and demographics who are in ongoing struggles for their betterment. However, this support tends to mask their own personal bigotry against the very group they are supporting.
You might recall that in my Desecration of Femininity video, I gave Vaush a special mention, using him as an example of that particular kind of male feminist who is actually just a massive misogynist. So Vaush, being an intelligent man, decided to do a response where he disproved my point.
I'm going to evoke several millennia of oppression against you, stupid fucking bitch. If anyone makes an expression like this at the camera at any point, it's legally okay to be sexist towards them.
This is because a person can agree with or feel sympathy for a group while simultaneously considering that same group to be inferior or lesser in various ways. They can advocate for women's rights while being misogynistic or feeling that they are superior to women. They can stand up for gays while holding false or prejudiced beliefs or feelings against gay people. Why would anyone do this, you may ask? Well, there are reasons, such as making a living off of their advocacy for marginalized groups, while not actually caring for them in the least. In such cases, however, people would be more center-left, so that they can give room to defend or back talking points for hate groups while simultaneously pretending to care for the well-being of the targets of those same hate groups. Some may argue that these people must care, considering that they donate money to certain causes or take positions defending marginalized groups in debates, but that once again does not necessarily have anything to do with their personal beliefs or their own treatments of such people.
Nothing like a fat man dancing for his dinner. Here you go.
Consider Abraham Lincoln. Most people around the world are under the impression that the abolition of slavery was one of Lincoln's goals alongside keeping the Union unified when he waged the American Civil War. This falsehood also leads people to believe that this is an indication that he at the very least considered Negroes to be equal humans to white folk and should have the same rights as white Americans.
It ain't the way it happened at all!
Horace Greeley was the founder and editor of the New York Tribune. He published an editorial urging and calling on Lincoln to free all enslaved people in the South. This was a portion of Lincoln's response to him. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Regarding his views and beliefs on colored people's place in society, during a debate in Quincy, Illinois on the 13th of October, 1858, Lincoln responded to the assertion that he saw no distinction between races, which was made by his opponent, Stephen A. Douglas. I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermingling with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which will ever forbid the two races of living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior, and I am as much as any other man in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Here, this was not Lincoln simply being a product of his time. This was Lincoln expressing his true beliefs and making his position clear in order to win votes. It's a weak argument to bring up the zeitgeist of his era when there were people of his day who believed in the exact opposite. There were even scholars before him who believed in the opposite. It's exactly the shallow thinking people have to justify the contradictory nature of the relationship between public figures' actions, words, stances, activism, endorsements, and so on, that allows them to sometimes do more harm than good for a movement. And the worst damage that they cause is often preventing actual change, if that change will in any way hurt their income or make them uncomfortable somehow. It also allows them to get away with all manners of harm they themselves do in their personal lives. And they get away with these things because people's cognitive biases lead them to downplay the harm that they cause and emphasize the things that they agree with. In the US, this also leads them to strange ideas such as voting blue no matter who, ignoring the fact that the blue they're voting for may be just as bad or potentially worse than the red they are trying to avoid. However, and this is important, none of this means that those who are openly bigoted are in any way the lesser of two evils. In fact, they often use these secretly bigoted liberals as red herrings to make themselves look better when they are just as bad. This is actually ironic because the people on the right who so often accuse people on the left of virtue signaling are themselves guilty of it in the most malicious, underhanded form possible, whereby they accuse a supposedly left-leaning public figure of some bigotry when they themselves are openly bigoted against the same people.
Here's a big irony. A lot of people don't realize this. Of course, they know that, Che Guevara was basically an evil dictator, kind of like Hitler without the charm, without the skill. But something a lot of people don't know is that Che Guevara, ironically, was very anti-gay, rabidly anti-homosexual. And now you have this wonderful faggot. That's what happens. We okay? We good? Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Darling, you can call me what you like.
Oh, okay, there we go. Did he just make a fat joke? Yeah, I did. And no, it's okay, because I got some here, so screw you. I have a faggot pass and a fat pass today.
They do not actually care about any of the victims or targets of bigotry. They care about votes, about money, about supporters, about stakeholders, or rather what stakeholders have to offer, about lobbyists, and most importantly, about themselves at the expense of others.
That doesn't work either!
It is usually better to have a person be open about their bigotry than to conceal it and hide in plain sight. But this does not make one or the other any better. It is simply an illusion in perspective to think that one is the lesser of two evils because of such a distinction. And it is absolutely insane to go so far as to side with one side for the reason of, at least they are open about their bigotry.
What did the Colonel promise you? You really think he'll let you live after we're gone? You let them call you donkey. You are...
An interesting thing is that the people to whom the pygmy is trying to appeal can and will exploit the pygmy for their own benefits when necessary as well. Case in point, organizations such as PragerU, Fox News, and the Daily Wire, the absolute masters of tokenism. They have tokens from a bag of every variety. Gen Z tokens, gay tokens, Asian tokens, black tokens, biracial tokens, transgender tokens. Their preferred strategy is to find someone who will appear to be an authority or representation on a matter or group they wish to discuss, and have that individual or individuals speak of the opinions that the organization holds for the organization, in an attempt to add some validity to their claims, or to be used as an example of appealing to authority. This person can then go on to say incorrect, outrageous, insulting, radical, and sometimes inciting things about a number of things and people, with some people actually falling for it because they assume that the fact that the person is a part of the group that they speak of, or that their profession somehow links to what they're talking about, which sometimes it doesn't, then what they're saying must be true.
I should know. I'm an expert.
Now, of course, these factors can have an effect on whether what they're saying is true or not. But very often, the purpose is simply to push an ideology or political tendency and then say, there, you see, even such and such person who is such and such demographic agrees with us.
And I've started thinking about this weekend in terms of the word discrimination. It's become a dirty word. You're not allowed to discriminate. Oh my God, that's discrimination. You shouldn't do that. You should not discriminate. And actually, quite frankly, I think we need to discriminate. I discriminate all the time, every single day. And this morning, I just jotted down a few examples of when I discriminate. And I'm going to share them with you so that you can feel comfortable sharing your list with your friends. Ready? I discriminate when I hire. I think that's probably illegal, but who doesn't discriminate when they hire? That wouldn't even make sense.
One reason regarding representation is that people will likely believe the individual because the viewer is sometimes not a part of the demographic and often knows little to nothing about the people of such a demographic. And so gaining knowledge from one so-called representative of the demographic that has views that lean in one direction somehow becomes enough evidence to not only believe them, but adopt whatever the representative is saying because they're clearly not interested in gaining their knowledge from anywhere else, or hearing about the experiences of people who lean in a different political tendency. Generally, you'll notice that conservative pick-me individuals have aspects about them that they deem to differ greatly from the stereotypical perception of others in their group, to the point where they feel the need to undermine the statements or experiences of others of the same group. This, of course, could be resolved if both sides simply spoke about the experiences of those involved and did not try to include other people of the same demographic into their struggle or experience, whether positive or negative, because not everyone in the same demographic will have the same problems or experiences. They will differ significantly in their income, level of education, or upbringing, for example. Now, despite this reality, in the case of Black Americans, for example, the pick-me blacks who have succeeded in life, regardless of their upbringing, will for some reason sometimes feel the need to discredit and downplay the struggles of other blacks on the basis of their own individual achievements. What they don't realize is that just because they made it does not mean that the factors that led to their success will be the same for others. They don't realize that there are factors that go beyond simply working hard and having a positive mindset. Take the case of Lisa Renee, an American woman who was abducted, raped, tortured, and killed due to her brother's illicit activities with drug dealers. This young lady was studying to become a nurse and had absolutely nothing to do with the drug deal gone wrong, but was the only person in the house when her brother's enemies came looking for them, and so she was taken. She did not choose to be born into that mess, and in fact she tried to overcome her unfavorable beginnings by working hard, but factors beyond her control came in the way of not only her success, but her very life. It is important to encourage people to overcome the adversities in their way and keep positive, but this must be done while acknowledging the fact that equal opportunities do not exist for everyone in the same society. And some people simply need to try harder than others because the situations beyond their control and that they're born into are harder than others.
I want to be like you. Females reject me left and right, so I've never dated anyone. Looks like y'all missing out on a 5'10" curly pre-med who's fairer skinned than 80% of Indians, so not my problem. Forgive me for being too desperate, but at my LA Airbnb mansion party winter break, I will collect all the entry fees and pay the hottest white female at the party a $1K gift. Drop in my album and having a listening party a day before my Airbnb mansion party in LA for my 21st. Only white and Latina females allowed at listening party. I want to spend alone time with y'all. Sound like a creep. I would be terrified to be alone with you. Another day, another blonde telling me I'm more attractive than most of my ethnicity. Once I make it as a rapper or med school, I'll go from I get no bitches, but at least I'm attractive to see me at 4 a.m. It's not a compliment, firstly, to be told you're good looking for someone of your race, because that's just a racist thing to say. No hate, just genuinely curious why brown girls make it their whole personality when they overwear Indian clothing while over-aggressively lip-syncing to Indian orders for clout tokens. Lamau. No hate, just genuinely curious why you make it your entire personality to beg for white girls to love you on TikTok and drag on brown women.
To effectively demonstrate just how far this pick-me concept can go, I will use the example of a certain tendency in Indian or Hindu culture and society. For the longest time, there are some people that by and large in their very culture and communities tend to perpetuate the system of division among humans by being pick-me's to try to create a superior perception of themselves in society, differentiate themselves from those who they consider lesser, and to appeal to those whom they admire and wish to emulate. While there are pick-me's of all kinds among all demographics, it is noticeable that a general trend among a considerable portion of people part of the Indian diaspora, as well as Indians in India itself, have a tendency to treat people better or worse depending on how they would internally rank them according to their ideas of a social order. This ranking is a bit inconsistent and confusing at times. For example, one may claim that they view a person better because they have more wealth, but the same individual may treat a person of an ethnicity that they consider to be superior better even when that person has less money than the wealthier person, if the wealthier person is of an ethnicity that they consider to be inferior. To speak bluntly, the reality is that a noticeable and significant amount of Indians tend to treat white people in particular better than everybody else, including other Indians. This statement should not be considered controversial, as it is equivalent to stating the fact that white Americans treated black Americans far more inhumanely after the American Civil War in southern states compared to other states. And it can be argued that to an extent it's still the case today, largely due to the number of blacks in such states, as well as the leadership of such states. And just as with that example having its reasons and origins, so too does the Indian sentiments and treatments towards and against some people in society. And it's not just that Indians simply treat white people better. These particular Indians want to emulate white people in whatever way they can, be it skin bleaching, or forcing a Western accent.
You don't tell me what to do.
I can tell you what to do.
You do not tell me what to do. You do not tell me what to do.
Or what? Are you going to hit me?
Do you want it?
I don't want it.
Because you're asking for it. You're dying for it. Get off my back.
And this is also not simply some random misguided TikTok teenagers who may grow out of it. These sentiments are reflected in Indian media in different ways as well. So if the people you treat the best are of light complexion, who do you think you'll treat the worst? To understand this racism and colorism, it is important to understand the Indian caste system that you likely may have already heard of. We'll delve deeply into it in a moment, but an overview is that the Indian caste system is a social hierarchical classification system that for the most part determines one's standing in society, including one's professions, who one can marry, where one will generally live, how one will be treated by those higher in the system, their standing before the courts, and so on. The reason people lower in the caste system are generally darker skinned is actually due to the type of work they do, that generally involves working in the outdoors, while those of higher caste tend to work indoors, and this has been the case since ancient India. Today, therefore, one's caste can simply be assumed by considering how dark one's skin is, and this in particular has contributed to the resentment that some Indians feel against darker skinned people of other ethnicities. And since sub-Saharan Africans tend to generally be of a darker shade, you can imagine the perception they have based on that, coupled with other factors such as what they hear from the media and other types of stigmatization that has occurred throughout the years, sometimes influenced by racist Western so-called scholarship. More on this momentarily. Some Indians like to claim that the caste system no longer exists in modern times, but this is evidently false in practice.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that there are only two castes in India, the poor and those who contributed to freeing them from poverty. Mainstream media, in support of the Bharatiya Janata Party, ran headlines praising him for this new narrative. However, Modi failed to acknowledge the centuries of poverty and discrimination faced by the Dalit community in India. What Modi did essentially is set the mood for his party workers to use this vagueness to continue oppressing the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes in India.
Now, what makes this sort of discrimination and prejudice pygmy-ish in nature is that many of the type of Indians I'm talking about wish to make it clear that they are of a higher class than others even when they are outside of India, where caste systems don't exist as they do in India. And so one way to show that they are not just Indian, but a high-class Indian, is to differentiate themselves from other non-white people in a misguided attempt to put themselves on the same level as white people. Since, as I've previously mentioned, such people would classify white people at the top of an imagined hierarchy. And this in turn perpetuates the long-running divisive racial supremacist ideologies that many have and still do fight against, and thereby strengthening the status quo for the benefit of some at the expense of others. So it's the classic endeavor to put others down to look taller. This will include enthusiastically and sometimes desperately making their support for causes that favor predominantly white or Western positions known and clear, or even positions that are simply against non-whites.
Numerous Israeli posts demand Netanyahu's resignation. But there's another set of messages from Indians, and they are all in.
So the responses from Indian accounts have been extraordinary, to say the least.
Channels that just a few months earlier had not seen fit to send their journalists to cover unprecedented violence in India's northeastern state of Manipur, they dispatched reporters all the way to Israel.
There was a reporter who was asked to quiet down by Israeli soldiers because of how loudly he was trying to cover what was happening.
Another way involves being racist, disrespectful, offensive, degrading, or hostile to other non-whites in order to create a perception or illusion of a hierarchical difference between themselves, who are not white, and other people who are not white. So basically racial minorities in predominantly white societies.
One of my friends is really into Korean movies these days. I'm not trying to be racist, but Korean sounds to me like a Bihari man speaking with pan in his mouth.
Another way involves praising and lauding anything white, basically, at every opportunity, while being sure to remind everyone that they are Indian and not Pakistani. We should also not pretend, like many white people do not take advantage or pride from the obsession directed toward them from such people, because many do. And it's just as weird and embarrassing as the people obsessing over them.
Okay, thank you. You give me 100 rupees per photo. 100 rupees per photo.
I'm at the beach and I want to show you guys the beautiful view. God damn, I can't even see the water.
In South Africa, South African Indians tend to consider themselves South African first and Indian second, and separate from Indians from India, just as many Afrikaners consider themselves South African first and European second. Of course, it turns the other way around real quick when convenient. This is due to the history of being in the country for so long, just as Black Americans consider themselves American first. But even so, South African Indians tend to have very similar sentiments and attitudes regarding preferential treatment as Indians in India and other Indians in the Indian diaspora. Among Black South Africans, for a while it was an inside joke that Indians wished to be white and hated Black people. But now it's largely considered a mere fact of life, and not just among Blacks either. And this is ironic because in many cases, white South Africans are not very fond of Indians in return.
Hey, you're fucking idiots!
But this is not just on a racial ground. In my experience, this seems to be because many whites believe themselves to be in competition with Indians, especially for jobs, considering that both groups tend to have very similar average wealth, with only about 1% of white South Africans below the poverty line and about 6% for Indians. Just to put that into perspective, in 2017, it was 64% for black South Africans and 41% for coloreds. They also tend to live in the same neighborhoods, attend the same prestigious schools and universities. The only language most South African Indians can speak is English, and so on. And so, because many things in South Africa tend to be unnecessarily racialized, the corruption and incompetence of the predominantly black South African government tends to be something that other so-called racial groups in the country can be angry about together. And so that is another reason that South African Indians tend to try to distance themselves as much as possible from anything remotely black or having to do with indigenous Africans. And again, a reminder that this does not apply to all South African Indians. Here's the thing. Indians, particularly Hindus, have generally always had a problem with dark skin, and also particularly with African people. In brief, lower-class Indians who had to work lower-class professions would often gain a darker complexion due to being out in the sun for many hours, while the wealthy would be lighter skinned due to being indoors. These so-called lower-class professions already carried the stigma of rendering the person inferior among Hindus. But of course, it must also be mentioned that Persian, Mughal, and European rule over India has also influenced the negative dichotomy between dark and light skin. This has created many socioeconomic problems for dark-skinned Indians, but one problem it's also created is an inferiority complex. And this has made it so that when put in a situation wherein they feel in competition with others who are also seen as disadvantaged, they will try to differentiate themselves in whatever way they can to demonstrate to the group to which they are trying to appeal that they are better than the others. The reason we tend to see the worst of Indians is because Indians who emigrate from India tend to be higher up in the caste system. They are the beneficiaries of this system. This is of course primarily due to having the financial means to be able to do so. And it is incredibly interesting, as they possess both an inferiority and superiority complex at the same time. They feel inferior to white people and so try to emulate them, but they feel superior to everyone else and so treat them like dirt. And so the unjust, backward systems and delusions of grandeur that they benefit from back home and grew up believing their entire lives tends to follow them. And unfortunately, they tend to bequeath it to their children, thus perpetuating the cycle. Now, in Western countries, this Indian attachment to white people has been influenced by something else as well: the belief in Aryanism. Now, it's important to note first and foremost that the entire idea of race as a whole is insulting. It is a politically and sometimes socially constructed categorization of humans with no scientific basis. Ethnicity tends to have more meaning as it categorizes people on more practical grounds, such as culture, language, or geographical location. The entire concept of race is an outdated idea based on now falsified notions of so-called inalienable traits among different populations of people based on their appearance and/or geographical location. It's an incoherent mishmash of skin color, featureism, ethnicity, geographical origins, ancestry, and a pseudoscience of phrenology, with only some of these factors being mentioned and brought up when convenient and at other times ignored, especially when people try to rank humans in a hierarchy, which was in fact among the original purposes of constructing race as a categorization of humans in the first place, and to discriminate against entire populations of people and simultaneously cause divisions among said people. So although many people use the term colloquially and to refer to people of certain appearances, it is in fact important that people move away from the very idea of race and rather refer to people's ethnicities, as this has far more meaning and significance even in science. For example, there are over 3,000 ethnicities on the African continent alone, speaking over 2,100 languages. To simply categorize them as black has no meaning, especially for the different African groups themselves who have different cultures, societies, traditions, languages, and histories. But even more so when coupled with the fact that people who you consider black also live on different continents and have nothing to do with each other, besides some distant ancestry. The reasons this was done in the first place was based on falsified pseudoscientific ideas of inalienable traits among different populations of people, especially based on what they looked like and where they came from. I am of course aware of the many people who embrace the categorization of being black in an effort to build unity with other people who in various ways fall into that same categorization. This is especially due to the shared experiences and realities faced by black people all over the world. Things such as discrimination, colonization, and marginalization in societies. This unity is a positive aspect that black people derive out of such negative experiences and realities. And this positive unity often leads to bonding, compassion, and support among black people from all over the world. And of course, when this happens, this is a wonderful thing. However, it is important that this does not come into conflict with the greater goal of finding unity among all people, regardless of ancestry or what they look like. This can only be achieved when systems of oppression, discrimination, and prejudice on the basis of things such as ancestry and appearances are done away with at a systemic and societal level. This is why the entire idea of race as a concept should become obsolete, just as the idea of an Aryan race became obsolete, and today is only held by fringe groups. Now, with that being said, Aryanism was the belief that people of the now obsolete Aryan race were a superior race to all others in the world. Those who believed this believed that they were descendants of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and since the language has connections with those who speak so-called Indo-Aryan languages, which includes the majority of people who live in northern India, this led many such Indians to accept and be happy to believe that they are also a part of the big boys, the Aryan race. Consider this example.
I was deemed Aryan and Caucasian, but not white, and was not permitted to become a US citizen.
So his connection with the United States began when he enlisted in the army, shortly before the conclusion of World War I. And after the war, he sought to become a naturalized citizen, capitalizing on this legal precedent that had granted Caucasians access to such rights. Identifying himself as Aryan or Caucasian, he found himself at the center of a 1923 Supreme Court battle. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected Finn's argument, stating that he did not meet the, quote, common sense definition of white. Now, the court believed that the original framers of the law had intended only one type of person to be white: people from the British Isles and Northwestern Europe. Finn had such an interesting perspective during this legal case because he didn't try to fight for equality. What he actually tried to do was kind of sneak in through the back door. And he pointed out that he was a, quote, high caste Hindu, and stating that because he came from North India, the, quote, original home of the Aryan conquerors, then he must also belong to the Caucasian or Aryan race. Now, if you know anything about the caste system in India, it's pretty horrifying. He was trying to use this to his advantage to say, hey, we're not a monolithic group. There are levels and designations to people from India, and I'm at the top. And I'm of the same heritage as so many of these other groups who are allowed to be white.
So to bring this point home and see an example of this in action, let's consider the younger years of Mahatma Gandhi, when he first tried to advocate for the rights of South African Indians living in apartheid South Africa. Firstly, it's important to note that at least here in South Africa, there have always been attempts to hide or downplay Gandhi's open and pretty intense racism against Africans, believing them to be inferior in all ways, including genetic, believing that the Aryan race, that we already discussed, was superior to all other races, and that white people should remain in charge in South Africa, and his beliefs that specifically black people should be separated from Indians and not be thought of or considered the same due to his beliefs on the hierarchical differences I've just mentioned. He frequently referred to black people as Kafirs, which is a racial slur against blacks in English-speaking African countries. And he even wrote a letter to a health officer in Johannesburg asking that the council remove black people from a predominantly Indian location, because he did not want any black and Indian mixture. Therefore, besides being a racial supremacist in his younger years and partially in his later years, he was also one of the biggest pygmies in history.
Mahatma Gandhi?
Hey, tough guy. You about ready to start leading your people?
Never! I have to dance. Tap is in my blood. 2, 3, 4. Way down upon this Swanee River, far, far away.
Keep it up, Twinkle Toes.
Trying to appeal to whites with the old, we're different from the others, and by simultaneously putting down and belittling other groups of people. However, to conclude, you will find that there hardly lacks a pygmy in most demographics you can think of. If you think that you have tendencies to put other people down to elevate yourself, or idolize others so much that you wish to impress or stand out from among the crowd, perhaps this video could help in terms of self-reflection, and be more self-aware of your intentions and the source of the influence on your perception of yourself and others. I'm G.A. Soda. Goodbye.
God
When did God start caring about any of us? In fact, Moses, when did you start caring about slaves? Was it when you found out that you were one of us?
Don't listen to him.
No, he's right. I did not see because I did not wish to see.
Or you didn't see because you didn't wish to see? Ah! Well, that makes everything fine then, doesn't it?